The autumn breeze carried the scent of salt and seaweed through the quiet streets of Port Haven, a modest coastal town where fishing boats still outnumbered pleasure craft, and everyone knew not just your name, but your parents' names too. George Holliday guided his weathered Buick down Main Street, the late afternoon sun painting long shadows across storefronts that hadn't changed in 30 years. He was returning from his monthly checkup at the VA clinic in Portland, a routine he'd maintained since retiring from the Navy 15 years ago. The silver anchor pin on his lapel caught the sunlight, a small reminder of decades spent on ships that had carried him across every ocean on Earth. Martha's Diner came into view, its neon "open" sign flickering just as it always had. George pulled into his usual spot, nodding to Betty, the owner's daughter, through the window. She was already pouring his coffee, black, no sugar, before he made it through the door. "How's the back today, George?" Betty asked, setting the steaming mug on his regular corner table. "Same as always," he replied, with a slight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Doctor says I should take it easy, but he's been saying that for years." The diner was quiet this time of day, just a few regulars nursing their afternoon coffee. George's gaze drifted to the empty chair across from him, where Sarah used to sit. 5 years since cancer took her, but sometimes it felt like yesterday. Their children had wanted him to move closer after she passed. Jennifer in Seattle, Mark in Boston, but Port Haven was home. Besides, Nick called almost every week. The thought of his grandson brought a genuine smile this time. Nick was the only one who truly understood why George stayed. The boy, though at 28 he was hardly a boy anymore, had followed in his grandfather's footsteps, choosing service over comfort. Marine Corps instead of Navy, but George had forgiven him for that. A sudden roar of motorcycle engines from somewhere down the street made George's hand tighten imperceptibly around his coffee mug. The sound grew louder, then faded, but left behind a tension that hadn't been there before. "Third time today," Betty commented, refilling his cup. "Those bikes have been getting more common lately. Dad says he saw a whole group of them hanging around the old Wilson warehouse last week." George nodded but said nothing. He'd noticed them too, leather-clad figures on chrome machines, watching the town with predatory eyes. It reminded him of something he'd seen in the Philippines back in '85, before things went bad there. The phone in his pocket buzzed, drawing him from his thoughts. Nick's name flashed on the screen, and George felt that familiar mix of joy and concern that came with every call lately. "Everything okay?" Betty asked, noting his expression. "We'll see," George replied, reaching for the phone. Something in Nick's voice these past few calls had been different, worried. And now, as George answered with a quiet, "Hello?" he could hear it again, that tone that said trouble was coming, whether they wanted it or not. George sat at his kitchen table the next morning, the Port Haven Herald spread before him, coffee growing cold. The headline caught his eye: "Local businesses report rise in vandalism." Below it, a photo showed the shattered window of Henderson's pharmacy, spray paint marking the wall beside it, a crude skull with steel wings. "Third incident this month," George muttered, recognizing the symbol. He'd seen it painted on the back of leather jackets worn by the motorcycle gang that had rolled into town recently. The Steel Reapers, they called themselves. The hardware store couldn't wait any longer, though. George's leaky faucet had kept him awake half the night. The bell chimed as he pushed open the door to Harrison's Hardware, the familiar smell of wood shavings and metal filling the air. He found Phil Harrison in a hushed conversation with Officer Roberts near the paint supplies. Both men looked up quickly, tension visible in their shoulders. The conversation was interrupted by the rumble of motorcycles outside. 3 bikes pulled up to the curb, their riders dismounting with practiced arrogance. The lead rider, a tall man with a snake tattoo crawling up his neck, pushed open the door. George didn't move from his spot, watching as the bikers swaggered in. They wore their Steel Reapers patches like badges of honor, though none looked old enough to have earned any real badges in their lives. "Nice town you got here," Snake Tattoo commented to no one in particular, fingering merchandise on the shelves. "Quiet, peaceful." The threat in his voice was barely veiled. George felt their eyes on his Navy veteran cap and saw the sneers forming on their faces. The youngest one, barely out of his teens, nudged his companion and made a crack about old sea dogs, just loud enough to be heard. George found his washer, placed exact change on the counter, and headed for the door. As he passed the bikers, Snake Tattoo shifted slightly, bumping George's shoulder. Not hard enough to be a clear challenge, but enough to send a message. Outside, he paused to adjust his cap, using the motion to study the motorcycle's license plates. Most were local, but 2 were from out of state. Information worth knowing. Back in his truck, he pulled out his phone. Nick was supposed to arrive next week for a visit, and for the first time, George was grateful his grandson hadn't lost those combat-honed instincts. Port Haven was changing, and not for the better. "Hey, Nick," he said when the call connected. "Just checking you're still coming next Thursday?" He listened to the response, then added carefully, "Good. Think maybe we've got some catching up to do." The Coastal Gas and Go sat on the edge of town, its faded blue awning visible from the highway. George pulled up to Pump 3, his tank nearly empty after yesterday's trip to the VA. The morning sun hadn't yet burned away the coastal fog, giving the station an isolated feel. Only the elderly station attendant, Carl, was visible through the grimy window, absorbed in his morning crossword. He was reaching for the pump when the rumble of motorcycles broke the quiet. 6 bikes rolled in, surrounding his car like sharks circling prey. George recognized Snake Tattoo from the hardware store, but the man who dismounted the lead bike was new, taller, older, with Blade stitched on his leather vest. The chrome on their Harleys gleamed menacingly in the weak morning light. "Well, look who it is," Blade drawled, eyeing George's Navy veteran license plate frame. "The old sailor himself! Figured we'd run into you again." George kept his movements steady, inserting his credit card as if the bikers weren't there. Years of combat experience had taught him that showing fear only encouraged predators. Inside the station, Carl had finally looked up, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Nice quiet town you got here," Blade continued, moving closer. His boots scraped against the concrete, leather jacket creaking. "Be a shame if something happened to disturb that peace." "Town's been peaceful for a long time," George replied evenly, watching their reflections in his car window. "Plans to stay that way?" Snake Tattoo laughed, the sound sharp and mocking. "Plans change, old man. Everything changes. World ain't what it used to be." The pump clicked off. George replaced the nozzle, aware of how the bikers had positioned themselves. 2 behind his car, blocking any retreat. 3 by the store entrance, their hands resting casually near their belts. Blade directly in front of him, close enough that George could smell leather and cigarettes. "You should move along," Blade suggested, his tone carrying an unmistakable threat. "While you still can. Town like this, lots of accidents can happen to old-timers who don't know when to retire." George met his gaze steadily. "This is my home. I don't run from bullies. Never have, never will." Blade's face darkened. He stepped forward, towering over George. "Maybe you should learn. Town's changing. Old men like you, you're just in the way. Relics of a past that don't exist anymore." George's hand tightened on his keys, but his voice remained calm. "We'll see about that. Sometimes relics have sharp edges." He got into his car slowly, deliberately, never taking his eyes off Blade. The bikers parted just enough to let him drive through, their sneers following him as he pulled away. In his rearview mirror, he saw them clustering around Blade, who was still watching his departure with cold calculation. Back home, George's hands shook slightly as he dialed Nick's number. His grandson answered on the second ring. Through the window, he could see another motorcycle cruising past, slower than normal traffic would warrant. "Nick? Think maybe you should come sooner if you can." He paused, watching the bike make another pass. "Things here are getting interesting. The kind of interesting things we talked about." His grandson would understand what that meant. They'd both seen enough combat to recognize the signs of impending trouble. George sat in his living room that evening, a glass of bourbon untouched on the side table. The wall before him held shadow boxes of medals and photographs, moments frozen in time from a life spent on the sea. His eyes fixed on a particular photo, USS Constellation, 1985, somewhere in the Philippine Sea. He stood among his crew, their faces young and serious, unaware of the chaos they'd face in the coming weeks. The dull ache in his back flared as he leaned forward, a souvenir from that time. The doctor at the VA kept suggesting surgery, but George had seen too many friends go under the knife and come out changed. Besides, the pain served as a reminder. Sometimes the most important battles were the ones you fought through, not around. A motorcycle's growl echoed from somewhere in the neighborhood, and George found himself automatically cataloging the sound. Not one of the Harleys from this morning, different pitch, probably Japanese make. His mind still worked the way the Navy had trained it. Observe, analyze, prepare. The Steel Reapers were watching his house, no doubt about that. 3 different bikes had passed by since sundown. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through recent photos Nick had sent. His grandson in full Marine dress uniform, receiving a commendation for his unit's security operations in disputed territories. The boy, man now, had his grandmother's eyes and the same stubborn set to his jaw that George saw in the mirror every morning. "Taking the early flight tomorrow, Grandpa," Nick's last text read. "Should be there by noon." George moved to his desk, opening the bottom drawer where he kept his most private mementos. The leather of his old service logbook was cracked with age, its pages yellowed. Inside, carefully preserved, was a newspaper clipping from '85. U.S. Navy crew prevents terrorist attack on civilian port. The article didn't mention names, just quick action by naval personnel. That was fine by George. The real story wasn't in the papers anyway. His fingers brushed against something else in the drawer. Sarah's last letter, written when they both knew she wouldn't see another spring. "Promise me you'll keep living," she'd written. "Not just existing, living." The rumble of another motorcycle passing drew his attention back to the present. Through the window, he watched the bike slow as it passed his driveway. The rider's leather jacket bore the steel-winged skull of the Reapers. They were getting bolder, more obvious in their surveillance. George's jaw tightened. He'd seen this pattern before, intimidation leading to violence. But Port Haven wasn't some distant port where trouble could be contained. This was home, Sarah's home. The place where their children had grown up, where Nick spent his summers learning to fish and fix engines. He picked up his bourbon, finally taking a sip. Tomorrow, Nick would arrive, and decisions would need to be made. The Steel Reapers thought they were dealing with a tired old man. They'd soon learn what decades of naval service really meant. Sometimes the most dangerous waters were the ones that looked calm on the surface. The noon bus from Portland pulled into Port Haven Station right on schedule, brakes hissing as it came to a stop. George watched from his parked Buick as passengers filed out, until a tall figure in civilian clothes emerged, carrying a single duffel bag. Even in jeans and a plain black t-shirt, Nick moved with the unmistakable precision of a Marine, his eyes automatically sweeping the perimeter of the station. "You're looking old, Grandpa," Nick grinned as he approached, but his eyes were already scanning the surroundings, noting details most would miss. The fresh paint covering graffiti on the station wall, the nervous glances from other passengers. George embraced his grandson, feeling the tension in the younger man's shoulders. "And you're looking too serious. Sarah's Diner still serves the best burger in 3 counties. Hungry?" The drive to the diner was quiet, both men watching the streets of Port Haven through different but equally trained eyes. Nick noticed the fresh tire tracks in his grandfather's driveway as they passed the house, the way certain storefronts had new security cameras installed, the subtle signs of a town preparing for trouble. "Place has changed," Nick commented as they settled into a corner booth at Sarah's. Betty approached with coffee, her smile warming as she recognized George's grandson. The diner was half empty, unusual for the lunch hour. "Nick, you've grown since last summer." She poured their coffee, then lowered her voice. "Good timing, too. Your grandpa could use the company lately." After she left, Nick leaned forward. Want to tell me what's really going on? Those bike tracks in your driveway aren't from Sunday riders. George took a slow sip of coffee. Steel Reapers. Showed up about 2 months ago. Started small. Vandalism, intimidation, getting bolder now. Henderson's pharmacy got hit last week. Phil's hardware the week before that. The guy with the snake tattoo who passed us on Main Street. One of them? George nodded, impressed but not surprised that Nick had caught that detail. They're watching the house. Testing boundaries. Making sure everyone knows they're in charge now. Police? Undermanned and overwhelmed. Sheriff's got 3 deputies for the whole county. And word is, one of them might be on the Reaper's payroll. Nick's jaw tightened. A gesture so like his grandfather's that Betty, watching from behind the counter, felt a moment of déjà vu. And you're staying because… Same reason you joined the Marines, George replied evenly. Some things are worth fighting for. Their burgers arrived, but Nick's attention was on the street outside, where another motorcycle cruised past, deliberately slow. How many? Core group's about 15, others come and go. Their leader calls himself Blade. Ex-military, if you believe the rumors. Dishonorable discharge. Nick nodded, processing the information with military efficiency. His hand unconsciously touched the phone in his pocket. We're going to need a plan, Grandpa, and some help. George smiled slightly. For the first time since the trouble started, he felt the tide beginning to turn. I was hoping you'd say that, son. I was hoping you'd say exactly that. Dawn found Nick jogging along Port Haven's waterfront, his steady pace masking his careful observation of the town. He noted delivery schedules, security camera positions, patterns in the early morning traffic. Old habits from his security operations training died hard. Each alley and intersection could be either a vulnerability or an advantage. It all depended on how you used the terrain. A fishing boat chugged into the harbor as he rounded the marina. 2 motorcycles were parked outside Joe's bait shop, their chrome still gleaming in the dim light. Inside, he could see leather-clad figures talking to Joe, their body language suggesting it wasn't a friendly conversation about fishing gear. Nick slowed his pace, timing his pass just right. Through the shop's open door, he caught fragments of conversation. Protection fees, and accidents happen. Joe's face was pale, his hands trembling as he nodded repeatedly. One of the bikers wore the now familiar snake tattoo, while the other had a fresh scar running down his left cheek. When Nick returned to the house, George was already up, coffee brewing. Saw you went for a run? Getting to know the new Port Haven? Town's changed more than I thought, Nick replied, grabbing a mug. Joe at the bait shop's got unwanted company. They're running a protection racket, but it's just the beginning. Seen this pattern before in other places. George nodded grimly. Sheriff says his hands are tied without evidence. Everyone's too scared to file official complaints. Last week, Henderson's daughter tried to report the pharmacy vandalism. Next day, her car's tires were slashed. Nick pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts. Made some calls last night. 2 guys from my old unit are stationed at Lewis McCord. They're due some leave. Rodriguez and Martinez. You met them at my graduation. Marines on vacation? George raised an eyebrow. In Port Haven? Something like that. Nick's smile was thin. Thought they might enjoy some fishing. They've got experience with this kind of situation. A motorcycle roared past the house, the rider making a show of slowing down to look in their windows. Nick memorized the plate number automatically, adding it to his mental list. 3rd different bike this morning. They were running surveillance shifts. They're getting bolder, George observed, watching his grandson's face. Good. Nick's voice was cold. Overconfident people make mistakes, and we'll be ready when they do. These aren't hardened criminals. They're bullies who've never faced real resistance. George studied his grandson's face, recognizing the tactical mind at work. Sometimes it was hard to see the boy who'd once fished off his dock in the hardened Marine before him. But these days, Port Haven needed the Marine more than the boy. Just remember, George cautioned, this isn't a war zone. These are still our neighbors, our streets. No, Nick agreed. watching another bike cruise past, this one moving slower than the others. Not yet, but if we don't stop this now, it will be. Some fights find you whether you want them or not. The corner store's bell chimed as Nick stepped inside, early afternoon sun casting long shadows through the dusty windows. Old Mr. Chen looked up from behind the counter, his usual greeting dying on his lips as Snake Tattoo and 2 other reapers blocked Nick's path. The store's ancient air conditioner hummed in the background, barely cutting through the summer heat. "Well, look who it is," Snake sneered, fingering the steel wings on his vest. "The old man's backup has arrived, though we smelled marine stink in town." Nick ignored them, moving toward the cold drinks section. His stance was relaxed, but his weight was balanced, ready. Through the security mirror above the shelf, he watched Snake's reflection approach. The other 2 reapers spread out, trying to flank him. Amateur tactics, telegraphing their intentions. "Hey, I'm talking to you, Marine." Snake's voice had an edge now. "We saw you running this morning, checking out our town, getting a little too curious for your own good." "Your town?" Nick selected a Gatorade, voice neutral. "Funny, I don't remember seeing your name on the welcome sign. Must have missed it between the bullet holes and spray paint." The bigger of Snake's companions, a heavy-set man with brass knuckles poorly concealed in his pocket, stepped closer. His boots squeaked on the linoleum, betraying his movement. "Maybe you need a lesson in respect, jarhead." Mr. Chen's hands disappeared beneath the counter, probably reaching for the shotgun Nick knew he kept there. "No trouble," the old man pleaded. "Please, no trouble. I just fixed window from last time." "No trouble at all," Nick agreed, turning to face them fully. His eyes met Snake's, cold and assessing. "These gentlemen were just leaving, aren't you?" Snake's hand shot out, shoving Nick's shoulder. "Make us!" The Marine's response was instantaneous. Snake's wrist was caught, twisted, and locked behind his back before he could blink. The bigger man rushed forward, but Nick used Snake as a shield, stepping aside at the last moment. The 2 reapers collided, stumbling into a display of chips. Bags exploded across the floor, filling the air with the scent of artificial cheese. "First one's free," Nick said quietly, releasing Snake. "Next one won't be, and I won't be as gentle." The 3rd reaper, younger than the others, had already backed toward the door, hand trembling on his knife. Snake scrambled up, face red with rage and embarrassment. "You're dead! You hear me? Dead! Blade's gonna hear about this!" "Leave," Nick suggested. His voice hadn't changed, but something in his eyes made them hesitate. "Now." They fled, bikes roaring to life outside. Nick paid for his drink, adding extra for the damaged display. "You okay, Mr. Chen?" The old man nodded, hands shaking slightly as he put his shotgun away. "Your grandfather, he's a good man. You are a good man too. But they are very bad men. They will come back more next time." "Not bad," Nick corrected, watching the bikes disappear down the street. "Just bullies who've forgotten what real strength looks like." He pulled out his phone, dialing. "Hey, Rodriguez, about that fishing trip? Better make it sooner rather than later. Seems Port Heaven's got a pest problem that needs attention." The sound of breaking glass shattered the pre-dawn quiet. George was already moving, muscle memory from years of shipboard emergencies taking over. In the guest room, he heard Nick's footsteps, quick and controlled. They met in the darkened hallway, Nick holding his tactical flashlight low. Another crash from outside, followed by the distinctive sound of motorcycle engines revving. Through the window, they could make out 5 figures in the yard, their leather jackets reflecting the streetlight. "Stay back," Nick whispered, but George was already heading for the door. Outside, the smell of gasoline hit them. Someone had dumped it across George's prized rose garden, Sarah's favorite flowers now drowning in fuel. "Hey, old man," Blade's voice carried across the yard. "Just give your garden some special fertilizer." The other reapers laughed, their bikes idling menacingly in the street. Snake stood beside Blade, his face still bruised from the encounter at the store. Nick stepped forward, but George caught his arm. "House cameras are running," he murmured. Sheriff needs evidence. His voice hardened. Besides, those roses were your grandmother's. This isn't just about us anymore. Blade hurled another bottle, this one filled with paint. It exploded against the porch, splattering red across the white boards. That's for interfering with business, Marine. Next time it won't be painted. Nick's hand tightened on his flashlight, knuckles white. He counted 4 bikes, one with a fresh dent in the exhaust, probably from the store incident. Details that could identify them later. "You boys must be lost," George called out, his voice carrying the authority of a senior officer. "Sheriff's station is just down the road. Need directions?" "Sheriff can't help you now," Snake sneered. But there was uncertainty in his voice. The old man and his grandson weren't reacting with the fear they'd expected. A distant siren wailed, growing closer. The Reapers mounted their bikes, Blade lingering last. "This is just the beginning," he promised. "Nobody disrespects the Steel Reapers. Nobody." As the bikes roared away, Nick was already photographing the damage with his phone. Got their plates, and the cameras should have clear shots of their faces. George surveyed his ruined garden, decades of careful tending destroyed in minutes. The roses Sarah had loved so much were wilting in the gasoline. "This changes things," he said quietly. Nick nodded, sending the photos to his contacts. "Rodriguez and Martinez will be here tomorrow." 3 more guys from the unit asked for leave when they heard what's happening. "They're escalating faster than we expected," George noted, picking up a broken piece of his porch railing. "No," Nick corrected, his voice hard. "They're making mistakes faster than we expected. And now we've got proof." He gestured to the security cameras. "Time to show them what real Marines can do." George looked at his grandson, seeing not just the Marine, but the boy who'd once helped Sarah tend these same roses. "Just remember what we're fighting for." "I'm looking at it," Nick replied, surveying the vandalized home. "Some things are worth protecting, no matter the cost." The Port Haven Community Center hadn't been this full in years. Nick stood at the back, watching faces he remembered from childhood summers, now marked with worry and fear. George sat in the front row, his presence drawing frequent glances from the townspeople who'd answered their call for a meeting. Sheriff Cooper leaned against the wall near the door, his deputy standing nervously beside him. The attack on George's house had finally forced him to take public action, though his tired eyes suggested he knew it might be too little, too late. "We can't just let them terrorize us," Tom Henderson said, standing up. His pharmacy's windows were still boarded from the last attack. "My daughter can't even drive to work without being followed." "This isn't the Port Haven I know." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Mr. Chen rose next, his voice shaky but determined. "Yesterday they broke more than just the window. Break spirits. But Marine Boy," he nodded toward Nick, "he showed us they are not so tough when we stand up." "And get ourselves killed," someone called from the back. "You've seen their numbers growing. They've got friends coming in from other towns now." Nick stepped forward, his presence commanding attention without effort. "So do we." He gestured to Rodriguez and Martinez, who'd arrived that morning. Their military bearing was unmistakable. "But we need your help. We need your eyes, your ears, and most importantly, your courage." "What exactly are you proposing?" Sheriff Cooper asked, though his expression suggested he already knew. "Neighborhood Watch Program," Nick explained. "Organized, coordinated, and legal. Camera networks, communication chains, designated safe houses. Make it impossible for them to threaten anyone without being seen and recorded." George stood, his voice carrying the weight of decades of respect in the community. "I've watched this town grow for 40 years, seen children born, grow up, have families of their own. The Steel Reapers think they can take that from us through fear. They're wrong." "But the risks!" Betty from the diner wrung her hands. "They've already hurt people who stood up to them." "They've hurt people who stood alone," Nick corrected. "Together, coordinated, we're stronger. My team can train volunteers in basic security protocols. Legal ones," he added, nodding to the sheriff. Rodriguez stepped forward. "We're not suggesting vigilante action. We're talking about community defense, making it too difficult for them to operate freely. Slowly, hands began to rise. First Mr. Chen, then Henderson, followed by others. People began exchanging phone numbers, forming groups based on neighborhoods. Nick watched the transformation with satisfaction. The Steel Reapers had made a critical mistake. They'd pushed hard enough to make people more afraid of living under terror than standing up to it. "It's a start," he told George quietly. "But Blade won't take this lying down." George nodded, watching his neighbors finally finding their courage. "No, he won't. But neither will we." The morning after the community meeting, Nick and George walked out of the post office to find their path blocked by 4 motorcycles. Blade himself stood in the center, flanked by Snake and 2 larger bikers Nick hadn't seen before. The Steel Reaper's leader wore dark sunglasses, but his jaw was tight with barely contained rage. "Quite a gathering you had yesterday," Blade said, his voice deceptively calm. "Lot of people forgetting their place in this town, making decisions they might regret." Nick moved slightly, positioning himself between the bikers and his grandfather. He noted the bulges under their jackets. They were armed, probably with more than just knives this time. The new bikers had fresh patches on their vests, suggesting reinforcements had arrived. "Town's got plenty of places," George replied evenly. "None of them belong to you." Blade removed his sunglasses, revealing cold eyes with a familiar hardness. Military training showed in his stance, confirming the rumors about his past. A thin scar ran along his temple, barely visible beneath his cropped hair. "You know what your problem is, old man? You think because you wore a uniform, because your grandson here plays Marine, that you understand how things work. But you don't. This isn't about territory, cabal. It's about reality. The world changed. Power belongs to those who take it. Power belongs to those who earn it," Nick countered. "Through respect, not fear." Blade's laugh was sharp. "Respect? Ask your grandfather how much respect his pension buys. Ask these townspeople how much respect their honest living earns them. We provide a service, protection, organization, structure. All we ask is proper compensation." "You mean extortion?" George said. "Call it what you want." Blade stepped closer. "Here's the deal. You've got 24 hours to shut down your little neighborhood watch program. Everyone who signed up yesterday publicly withdraws. You and your Marine friends leave town. Do that, and maybe we forget about your disrespect." "And if we don't?" Nick asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then we stop being nice?" Blade's smile was cold. "Those roses we killed? That'll seem like gardening compared to what comes next. 24 hours." They mounted their bikes, engines roaring to life, but Blade lingered a moment longer. "You know what's funny? In another life, we might have been on the same side, Marine. But you chose wrong. This time tomorrow, remember that." As the bikes pulled away, George noticed his grandson's hands were clenched tight. "He's not bluffing," Nick said quietly. "That look in his eyes, he's done bad things before." "I know." George watched the bikes disappear. "Question is, what are we going to do about it?" Nick checked his phone. "Rodriguez has 3 more guys coming in tonight. But Blade's right about one thing. This isn't about territory. It's about choosing sides." The ultimatum hung in the air like gun smoke, and both men knew the next 24 hours would change everything. Port Haven had never seemed so quiet. As evening approached, streets emptied early, shops closed before dusk, and windows were shuttered tight. The deadline Blade had given them ticked away with each passing hour, marking time like a countdown to an explosion. Nick stood at George's living room window, watching Rodriguez and Martinez set up surveillance points around the neighborhood. 3 more Marines had arrived an hour ago, Wilson, Chang, and Cooper, each bringing equipment that technically wasn't signed out from base. "They're moving," Nick reported, noting a motorcycle passing by for the 3rd time. "Setting up observation posts of their own." George sat at his desk, cleaning his old service pistol with practiced movements. "Called some of my own contacts. 2 former Navy SEALs are in Portland. They'll be here by midnight. This is going to get worse before it gets better, Nick said, checking his phone. The neighborhood watch network was buzzing with reports of steel reapers gathering at their warehouse. Blades called in at least 20 more riders from other chapters. Town's choosing sides, George observed. Through the window, they could see Mr. Chen installing security cameras at his store. Down the street, Henderson's pharmacy had lights on late, several volunteers reinforcing the windows. Martinez's voice crackled over the radio. Movement at the north end. 3 bikes doing recon. They're mapping our positions. Let them look, Nick replied. But don't engage. Not yet. George finished with his pistol, the metal gleaming in the fading light. Sarah always said this town was worth fighting for. Guess she knew something like this might happen one day. We're not just fighting for the town anymore, Nick said, watching another bike cruise past. We're fighting for what it represents. People's right to live without fear. The radio crackled again. 2 more groups spotted at the South Marina. They're boxing us in. Nick checked his watch. 15 hours left until Blade's deadline. They'll probe our defenses tonight, testing our resolve. And tomorrow? George asked, though he already knew the answer. Tomorrow we show them what happens when you push Marines too far. Nick's voice was cold. Rodriguez, maintain positions. Radio silence unless contact is made. The sun set over Port Haven, casting long shadows across empty streets. In houses throughout town, people waited, watching, choosing between fear and resistance. At the warehouse, Blade gathered his forces, preparing to crush this rebellion against his authority. Get some rest, Nick told his grandfather. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. George nodded, but they both knew sleep wouldn't come easy, not with the sound of motorcycles echoing through the darkness, like wolves circling their prey. The battle for Port Haven was about to begin, and there would be no backing down for either side. The attack came at midnight, exactly as Nick had predicted. The Steel Reapers struck from 3 directions simultaneously, their bikes running dark until the last moment. Rodriguez's voice cut through the radio silence. Multiple contacts, north and east, at least 15 bikes. Nick watched from his position at George's upstairs window as headlights suddenly blazed to life, illuminating the street like rolling thunder. Blade led the main force, heading straight for the house. 2 smaller groups split off, targeting the neighborhood watch positions. Hold positions, Nick commanded. Let them commit. The bikes roared closer, their riders carrying bats, chains, and worse. But as they reached the intersection, floodlights erupted from concealed positions. The Marines had set up a kill zone, and the Reapers had ridden right into it. Now, Nick ordered. Police cruisers shot out from side streets, blocking escape routes. Marines emerged from shadows, moving with practiced precision. The Steel Reapers, caught in the bright lights, scattered in confusion. Blade gunned his engine, heading straight for George's house. 3 riders followed him, while others engaged in a chaotic fight with Nick's Marines. The sound of breaking glass and shouts filled the night air. Front door, Rodriguez called out. They're trying to breach. Nick was already moving, hearing the crash of the door giving way. He reached the stairs just as Blade and 2 others burst in. George stood at the bottom, shotgun leveled. That's far enough, the old sailor commanded. Blade laughed, but it was a desperate sound. Do you think this changes anything? This is our town now. Your town? Nick's voice came from behind them. He'd circled through the kitchen, cutting off their retreat. Look outside. Look what your power got you. Through the broken door, they could see the street. Several Reapers were already in handcuffs, while others fled into the night. The Marines had executed their plan perfectly, using the Reapers' own aggression against them. Blade spun, drawing a pistol, but Nick was faster. A quick strike disarmed him, followed by a sweep that put the gang leader on the floor. His followers, seeing their leader down, raised their hands. It's over, Nick said, securing Blade's wrists with zip ties. Port Haven isn't yours. Never was. You don't understand, Blade spat. There are more of us. Others will come. Let them, George replied, lowering his shotgun. We'll be waiting. This town knows how to fight back now. Outside, sirens wailed as state police arrived to support the local sheriff. The Neighborhood Watch Network reported reapers fleeing in all directions. Their attempted show of force turned into a rout. "Grandfather," Nick called out, "you okay?" "Better than okay," George answered, looking at the captured gang leader. "Some fights find you whether you want them or not. Good thing we were ready for this one." Dawn crept over Port Haven, revealing the night's chaos in harsh detail. Overturned motorcycles littered the streets, while state police photographers documented evidence. George stood on his porch, surveying the damage. The door hung crooked on its hinges, and scattered glass glittered in the morning light. 7 in custody, Nick reported, joining him, including Blade. Sheriffs got them locked down tight, state police standing guard, but at least 12 got away. Inside the Steel Reaper's warehouse, now cordoned off with yellow police tape, Rodriguez and Martinez helped officers catalog evidence. They'd found more than just weapons. Documents revealing protection rackets, drug distribution plans, connections to larger criminal networks. "Blade was building something bigger here," Rodriguez said over the radio. "Port Haven was just the beginning. Found maps of 3 other coastal towns, marked for expansion." George watched Mr. Chen sweep broken glass from his sidewalk. Other townspeople were emerging too, assessing damage, helping neighbors. The fear that had gripped them for months was lifting, replaced by something stronger: community. "They'll be back," Nick said quietly. "The ones who escaped. Maybe not today, but soon. They can't let this stand. It'll damage their reputation with other chapters." "Let them come," George replied. "Town's different now. We're different." At the police station, Sheriff Cooper interrogated Blade, whose arrogance had crumbled into simmering rage. "You've got no idea what's coming," the gang leader spat. "This isn't over. Port Haven's going to burn." But his threats rang hollow. Outside his cell, deputies logged calls from townspeople offering security footage, witness statements, evidence of past crimes. The wall of silence was breaking. Nick's phone buzzed, a message from his Marine unit. "More help's coming," he told George. Word spread about what happened here. Other veterans, other towns dealing with similar problems. They want to know how we did it. "We did it together," George said, watching Betty from the diner distribute coffee to cleanup volunteers. "That's what Blade never understood. Real strength isn't about fear. It's about community." The morning sun climbed higher, warming the cool coastal air. Port Haven was battered but unbroken. Here and there, evidence of the night's battle remained. Skid marks on asphalt, dents in walls, broken windows being repaired. But something else remained too. Determination in people's eyes, straight backs where they'd once been hunched in fear. "Going to need a new door," George observed, examining the splintered frame. Nick smiled slightly. "Already got some volunteers coming. Seems the whole town wants to help rebuild." "Whole town helped defend it," George replied. "Only fair they help repair it too." The sound of hammers and saws filled the morning air, drowning out the memory of motorcycle engines. Port Haven was healing, growing stronger. The battle was over, but the change it brought was just beginning. State Police Captain Sarah Mitchell stood in Sheriff Cooper's office, reviewing surveillance photos spread across his desk. Her tactical team had arrived an hour ago, their presence adding another layer of security to Port Haven's streets. "These aren't just thugs on bikes," she said, tapping a photo of Blade's documents. "We're looking at organized crime. Drug trafficking, weapons, protection rackets across 3 states. Port Haven was meant to be their new hub." Nick leaned against the wall, George seated beside him. Through the window, they could see police cruisers patrolling the streets, a reminder that the battle wasn't over. 4 chapters are still unaccounted for," Mitchell continued. "Intel suggests they're mobilizing. Your victory last night embarrassed them. They'll want revenge." "Let them come," Sheriff Cooper said with newfound resolve. "Town's ready this time." The radio crackled, a deputy's voice tense. "Movement at the county line. Large group of bikes heading in. At least 30 riders." Nick straightened. "They're coming sooner than expected. Testing if we've let our guard down." Not just testing, George observed. Someone in the cells must have got word out. This is a rescue attempt. Captain Mitchell grabbed her radio. All units, full alert. Form defensive positions according to Plan Delta. No one gets near the station. Outside, the town transformed again. Shops closed, shutters dropped. But this time, people didn't hide. The neighborhood watch network crackled with activity, coordinating with police, sharing information. They're splitting up, Rodriguez reported from his observation post. 3 groups, main force heading downtown, others circling wide. Nick checked his phone. My guys are in position. We've got elevated coverage on all approach routes. Remember, Mitchell warned, these aren't just bikers anymore. These are criminals protecting their territory. They'll be armed, dangerous, and desperate. George stood, his voice steady. So are we. But we've got something they don't, a town worth fighting for. The distant rumble of motorcycles grew louder. Captain Mitchell deployed her tactical teams while Sheriff Cooper coordinated with the neighborhood watch. Years of police work had taught them both that the most dangerous fights were the ones where the enemy had nothing left to lose. Nick moved to the window, watching the town prepare. Marines in position, police ready, citizens standing firm. Port Haven had changed in ways the Steel Reapers never expected. Here they come, he said quietly. The first bikes appeared on Main Street, their riders armed and angry. Behind them, more followed. The Steel Reapers had returned for their revenge, but Port Haven was waiting, and this time they'd finish it once and for all. The Steel Reapers hit Main Street like a tidal wave of chrome and leather, their bikes roaring in unison. Leading them was a massive rider Nick's intel identified as Big Mike, the chapter president from Oregon. Behind him, dozens of bikes filled the street, their riders armed and ready for war. Hold positions, Captain Mitchell commanded over the radio. Let them come to us. The bikes stopped in front of the police station, engines growling. Big Mike dismounted, his voice booming across the sudden silence. We're here for Blade. Release him, and maybe we won't burn this town to the ground. Nick stood on the station steps, George beside him, Rodriguez and his Marines positioned strategically around the perimeter. State police snipers watched from rooftops, while local officers manned barricades. That's not going to happen, Nick called back. Your operation's finished. Port Haven isn't yours anymore. Big Mike laughed, the sound ugly and sharp. Look around, Marine. You're outnumbered. The odds aren't in your favor. Count again, George said clearly. As if on cue, doors opened all along Main Street. From shops, homes, and offices, townspeople emerged. Not running, not hiding, standing firm. Mr. Chen with his shotgun, Henderson and his employees, dozens more armed with courage and determination. This is your last warning, Captain Mitchell announced through a bullhorn. Surrender now or face arrest. Big Mike's response was a hand signal. Bikes revved, riders reached for weapons, but before they could move, a new sound cut through the tension. Police helicopters appearing overhead, spotlights pinning the Reapers in bright circles of light. It's over, Nick announced. You've got nowhere to go. The fight went out of the Steel Reapers like air from a punctured tire. One by one, they raised their hands, seeing the trap they'd ridden into. Big Mike, realizing his mistake too late, tried to run, but found himself facing Rodriguez and 3 Marines, their stance leaving no doubt about the outcome. Inside his cell, Blade heard his rescue attempt fall apart. His empire of fear, built so carefully, had crumbled against something stronger. A community united. Later, as state police loaded the arrested Reapers into transport vans, George and Nick stood watching from the station steps. Town's going to be different now, George observed. Nick nodded. Better, stronger. They learned how to stand together. Your grandfather taught me that, a voice said. They turned to see Mr. Chen approaching. In the Navy, he says, ships are only as strong as the crew. Town, same way. The sun broke through Port Haven's marine layer, casting long shadows across Main Street. But for the first time in months, those shadows held no fear. The town had faced its demons and won, not through force alone, but through the strength of its people standing as one. "Think they'll be back?" Nick asked quietly. George smiled, watching the townspeople begin to rebuild once again. "Doesn't matter. We'll be ready." 1 month later, Port Haven sparkled in the summer sun. George knelt in his garden, carefully planting new roses where the old ones had been destroyed. The soil was fresh and rich, promising new growth. Behind him, the house stood proud with its new door and repaired porch, the work of neighbors who'd refused to let him do it alone. Fresh paint covered any traces of the battle that had raged here. Nick sat on the steps, cleaning his gear. His leave was ending tomorrow, but things were different now. The town had changed, grown stronger. The neighborhood watch program had evolved into a permanent community security network, with Mr. Chen serving as the unlikely but effective coordinator. Even the sheriff's department had been transformed, with new deputies and better equipment. "Sheriff says they're prosecuting Blade and 32 others," Nick reported, checking his phone. "Federal charges with evidence from 3 states. They won't be getting out anytime soon. DEA's using their testimony to take down larger networks." George nodded, patting soil around a young rosebush. "And the others?" "Most left the area. The Steel Reaper's reputation is shot. Hard to intimidate people when a small town beats you. Their other chapters are falling apart too. Seems Port Haven started something bigger." Down the street, Betty from the diner walked past with her evening deliveries. The town had started a program to check on elderly residents each day, another positive change born from troubled times. She waved, and both men waved back. Through her window basket, fresh flowers brightened the early evening air. "Your grandmother would have loved this," George said, surveying the new garden. "She always said roses need care and courage to grow, just like a town. These new ones are her favorites, peace roses." Nick smiled, remembering summers spent helping Sarah tend these same flower beds. "Rodriguez is staying, you know, taking a job with the sheriff's department. Says Port Haven needs good people. Martinez, too. He's opening a security consulting business downtown." "Town's got plenty of good people," George replied, standing to admire his work. "They just needed reminding. Sometimes it takes a storm to show you how strong your roots are." The sound of a motorcycle made them both look up, but it was just Henderson's son on his delivery route. The rumble of bikes no longer brought fear to Port Haven's streets. Instead, the roads filled with families, children, and a renewed sense of community. "State police want to use Port Haven as a model," Nick continued. "Show other towns how to stand up to intimidation. Captain Mitchell's writing a formal program. They're calling it the Community Resilience Initiative." George stood, brushing dirt from his knees. His back ached less these days, as if the weight of fear had been physical as well as mental. "Not sure you can write a program for community spirit." "Maybe not," Nick agreed, "but you can inspire it. Show people they're stronger together than alone." The evening light turned golden, casting long shadows across the new roses. From somewhere in town, they could hear children playing, a sound that had been rare during the Steel Reaper's reign. The harbor bell rang in the distance, marking the return of fishing boats. "You did good, son," George said quietly. "Your grandmother would be proud." "We did good," Nick corrected. "All of us. Together." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set on a town reborn. Port Haven had faced its test and emerged stronger, not just through force of arms, but through the power of community. The roses would bloom again, and with them, the promise of a future free from fear. Some battles change more than territory. They change hearts, minds, and the very soul of a place. Port Haven had fought such a battle, and won.